very kindly been asked to give a bit of a presentation today. I'll skip through it as fairly sort of briskly as I can, really. And apologies if some of it is kind of, either very obvious or kind of, teaching you things that you already know, but just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, really. So some really fundamental stuff about, just the formation of rivers themselves. At the most basic level, some precipitation happens up in the mountains. Water makes its way down through the system towards the sea, and on the way takes on a variety of physical structures and forms. So the main processes that drive that whole procedure is that it's governed principally by erosion and deposition. So there's some kind of wearing away, if you like, or rubbing away of the mountain stuff, and then as that proceeds towards the sea, it gets dropped off and remobilised in different places as it goes along. And that's what produces these different structural forms as it goes on its journey. So things that lie behind that, obviously the precipitation regime. So is it ice or snow? Is the water locked up in wetlands when it hits the ground and released quite slowly? Or does it hit sort of bare rock, and does it then flash off very quickly? And that obviously influences these processes of erosion and deposition. There's also the runoff profile, which I said is linked to the speed with which that's released from the landscape, and so those two things are very sort of closely interlinked. There's also the bed slope as well. So in steeper areas, you'll tend to find that the channel is straighter, and then as the gradient dubs out a little bit, the rivers tend to wiggle around a little bit more. So that's just in a kind of a very quick nutshell. But the interesting thing for me, at least, is that you get these properties that just emerge. So rivers kind of, they build themselves, they build these structures themselves. Nobody tells them how to do it. They just naturally arise. So all of the cross sections and features that you can see highlighted down that little section of river there, they just are self-emergent properties. They're automatic, they're self-generating. And it's things like, inherent properties of water. When you look at raindrops running down a pane of glass, they don't run straight down the glass. There's little tiny micro differences in friction on either side of the droplet, and they actually wiggle as they go down the pane of glass. And it's exactly the same in rivers. And what you find is, on the inside of river bends, there's a little bit more friction than on the outside. So the water tends to go a bit faster on the outside of the bend. And because that friction's slowing the water on the inside, what eventually happens is that the water going faster, actually eventually it tucks underneath. And the water here is kind of flowing in a spiral coming out of the screen towards you. And it's just because of those differences in friction that send the water molecules left and right. And that's, it's critical to how these various features are produced. So there's scour on the outside and deposition on the inside of the bends as the velocity changes. So these, as well as being self-generating processes, they're also self-reinforcing processes, because obviously the deposition is enhanced on the inside of the bend, so that little point bar, which are these shallow beaches, actually grows, and it also helps to maintain this scour pool habitat on the outside of the bend, which is, it's just a fascinating process, really. Key thing, of course, is that it's the translation of the variation in physical habitat which offers more opportunities for biodiversity. So there's a very, very strong link between physical complexity and biological complexity, such that every tiny or every specific, if you like, variation in water depth, how fast it's travelling, the grain size of the substrate, the bed material that's actually retained under those conditions in particular patches and areas, and the inundation regime, so how the profile of how that channel is wetted and dried according to differences in rainfall, all of those specific conditions have their own biological communities, and that's true at all different levels of biological organisation. So just to give a little illustration of that, this is getting some use out of the model river, M River it's called, and basically you can see processes of bank erosion and deposition going on. So the paler areas are where you're getting areas of deposition, and the darker areas is where it's going faster, and it tends to be a little bit deeper as well, and that's where you're getting sort of net erosion.
Does that speed it up?
No, this is at real time. So this is another example as well, and it's associated with local sort of variations in structure. You can see as well it's a very dynamic process, so it's always changing, and that rate of change can be important as well. But you can see these different subtle variations in the physical habitat and structure. That's what gives you niche diversity. But it's also exactly the same processes that are happening in the model is what produces the specific structures you find in rivers and the communities that are associated with them. So it's exactly the same process that happens. Now, we're all pretty much very well aware of the barrier effect that weirs have, and that's kind of, it's obvious and it's a good thing to be concerned with, but it sort of also misses a massive and fundamental impact, which is the weir here is actually holding back a huge amount of water, and it's producing all of this open water habitat is exactly the same across the full cross section. So it's very bland habitat. There's not much opportunity for very many species. The only decent habitat is where the edges are trying to sort of encroach a little bit. You contrast that with unimpounded waters that are free flowing, and there's a much greater diversity. There's fast and slow, there's shallow and deep, and you can see just by the plant community structure there's much more opportunities for different kinds of life to exist. I'll just stop that one before it goes too far, because we'll come back to that in a second. So as well as those kind of macro features, if you like, where you've got the meanders and the things that are sort of generating those sort of shallow sloping point bars and scour pools, you also get very localized areas of variation as well. So where there's sort of inputs of debris and the water has sufficient energy and it's free flowing and not impounded, it actually produces these areas of localized scour. So it'll shoot out the riverbed material from where the flow's been focused into the riverbed, and then according to the current speed it'll actually drop that material out, and you end up in these conditions with what's called sorting of the substrate. So you'll see that the finer material drops out in the slower flowing portions of the river, and then the slightly larger grain sizes are kept completely separate. So it's not all aggregated together, which is what you often get where you don't have that variety in flow, velocity and depth. So as one example, you might find these sort of your silt-loving sort of mayfly species in the depositions of finer material. You might find stoneflies or things that like living in the interstitial spaces between the sort of loose, fluffy gravel. This stuff also is absolutely vital for gravel spawning species as well, because they need to have that silt-free sort of gaps and spaces between the grains so that the eggs get enough oxygen whilst they incubate. So this is another layer again of variety, and each little tiny strip of that habitat is slightly different, and it has its own characteristic communities that are associated with it. And that depends on the river being able to produce that energy and produce that variety for itself. The other thing that I really wanted to sort of get across as well is that, at least in biological terms, it's kind of dumb to actually make a division between the surface of the water and what happens in the wet bit of the river and the stuff that happens in the drier bit around it. In terms of the biology that lives there, that division is actually meaningless. It's just totally an anthropocentric thing. So just as one example, you obviously get leaf litter dropping in from the tree canopy. That's utilised as a food source. The nutrients from that support a whole range of different aquatic bugs and grubs. Lots of those also complete the life cycle by hatching out and flying around in the air. They need that vegetation to go and complete the adult stages of the life cycle as well, so that's kind of intrinsically linked in that way. But of course, whilst they're doing that, they're supporting all different members of the food web as well. So whether that's in daylight or at night time, or whether it's vertebrates or invertebrates, all of these subsidies are going on all the time. And of course the fish getting on the act as well, so you wouldn't want to leave those guys out. But it's not just leaf litter, of course there's a whole range of things that lives in the tree canopy. So you often get these crash landings that happen, terrestrial bugs and grubs, and of course they support all different parts of the food web as well. So basically, if you're looking at the interactions and the transfer of nutrients and how all of these species are relating to each other, those arrows and those interactions have really nothing to do with the water surface. The channel itself is generating the conditions that are suitable for the particular kinds of vegetation, and the particular kinds of vegetation support the characteristic communities of in the terrestrial part of the habitat. And then there's all these reciprocal subsidies that travel between the two. So it all is driven by this kind of physical form of the river corridor, and it's a river corridor as a whole. It's not just the wet bit. So this is just really to stress that, you know, in free-flowing, unimpounded watercourses, you get the scour pool formation that produces the deep pool habitat. You get the vertical cliff faces that suit other particular species. But you also get these shallow sloping beaches, if you like, on the inside of bends. And depending on the water flow at the time, you know, those are either inundated or dried out periodically as well. So you get that temporal variation as well as the spatial variation. All of those factors combined, you get obviously characteristic communities that are adapted to those specific conditions. And so again, it's just reinforcing the fact that all of this diversity in and around the channel is driven by these processes of the channel being able to form itself and create its own physical structure. So just before I get onto that, actually, just to kind of hammer that home really, again using the examples from the model river. So you've got the slow flowing water on the left, and obviously it's flowing faster towards the right of the screen. This is an example of that free flowing generation of all these different niches and microhabitats, and this is what happens when you don't have impoundments. You contrast that when you put a weir in. Obviously it's holding back all the water and the sediment here, and it's producing very, very similar bland habitat upstream. But because that sediment isn't able to be supplied downstream, the net amount of erosion that you get down here is vastly increased. So in the model, it's actually scoured right down to the equivalent of the bedrock. So that's like the metal base in this model river that we've got. And because of that, the net erosion is greater, but also because of the lack of the supply of this material that's trapped up here, you don't get the formations of the point bars and the beaches and the meanders and the gravel bars and the spawning riffles, because all that material is held up here, and then this channel is very simple down here, and it also responds to floodwaters much more rapidly. So you get these damaging, very highly energetic flows that come tearing down the channel, whilst retaining upstream of it. There's the sediment here and the very, very bland, samey habitat upstream of the weir. So you get these effects that span both upstream and downstream. So the contrast is where you've got free-flowing and a good supply of sediment that's able to be moved around by the river. That can produce, just the ideal niche conditions for supporting gravel spawning fish species, for example. But it also produces the substrate sizes, the flow depths, and velocities that are ideal for specific invertebrate species, but also supporting that wider food web as well, of course, that depends on that. So all of the kind of teeming variety that you get in kick samples when you take an invertebrate sample, that variation is critically dependent on the physical variety that's in the habitat. And so you get riffle specialists like dippers that can exist alongside, glide and pool specialists in very small areas, so you can maximise that diversity. So this is one of the reasons, or a very, very good reason, why weir removal, moving away from this simple impounded habitat and going back towards a more free-flowing situation, and being able to supply that sediment material from the top of the catchment throughout to produce all those conditions. That's why that is so important. So where you have significant impoundments, they're not just blocking fish migration. It's actually stifling the generation of physical diversity. And that's because of either the lack of the energy in the flow, because you're holding the water back and not giving it the opportunity to form those structures that we've talked about. But it's also critical to realise that it does interrupt that process of the sediment moving downstream and being available to make these depositional features. So they block more than just migrating fish. They also block the flow velocities that we've talked about to supply the riverbed material, forming that diverse habitat. And again, this is a key point for even if you're not interested in the biological side of things, because net erosion with a limited supply of upstream sediment is much greater. The implication there is that you have much more damaging erosive flows when you don't have that sediment available to be redistributed in the way that it otherwise would naturally do. It blocks the development of optimal biodiversity. So obviously all channels have some sort of impact of human activities on them, but you can always do either a better job or a worse job at actually maximising the potential for biodiversity. So having weirs in actually dramatically limits that optimal biodiversity. That of course also takes out of the equation the associated benefits that you get from those diverse functioning ecosystems. So you might phrase it as ecosystem goods and services. Structure and function is another way of looking at it. But those sorts of things might include, the passive cooling benefits that you get from a diverse riparian vegetation corridor, mitigating climate change impacts. There's also the opportunity to look at how floodwater moves through the catchment during extreme rainfall events, and we can be much, much smarter about how that is done using biodiverse and healthy ecosystems. Trees, again, and vegetation in general, they do a pretty good job at soaking up all kinds of nasties in the atmosphere. That includes carbon, but it's not restricted to carbon. But a key point on this one for me is that in those extensive impounded reaches, you tend to get the generation of extensive areas of anaerobic conditions. So as well as having these vertical sides where there's no sort of shallow sloping point bars for vegetation to grow up and do all the the nice soaking up of the pollutants, you also get these anoxic conditions where the microbes are producing methane instead of carbon dioxide. So significance of that is, of course, is that methane is a far, far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So these big impounded reaches are really, they're degraded on several levels, but certainly when you start looking at the provision of these services to society, it's crucially important. And another thing, to do with food security. Again, these areas, particularly in urban catchments, the riparian corridor and the river and the channel, everything within that corridor tends to be away from some of the more intensive agricultural practices. So they don't tend to have as much application of pesticides and that kind of thing. So again, they could act as little islands for these metapopulation dynamics of pollinating insects, which obviously without those guys we're going to have a hard time producing food. So there's all these things that spin out from the physical diversity that's created by channels when the flow is not sequentially impounded. And of course there's some really, really good evidence produced, for example, the Ursula project, measuring associations and links between very biodiverse urban river corridors and parameters associated with physical and mental well-being, as well as people's willingness to pay for property associated with those areas. So there was a very, very strong relationship between how diverse an area was and how much value that society placed on it. So there's a lot of things that feed in from this this process, which at its heart is driven by erosion and deposition, geomorphological processes. So thank you for that. And any questions?